switch. If that was done, then immediately you could start switching lots of technology from electrons to photons. Now, is there fundamentally quantum mechanics there? We're used to photons having interference patterns and so on. We're used to kind of the wave character of photons. We're more used to that than we're used to the wave character of electrons. Electrons, as a result of quantum mechanics, also have a wave character. At the level of the actual way that microprocessors are made, with feature sizes of a few nanometers and things like this, the wave nature of electrons does start to matter. And certainly in the
Right.
etching of semiconductors, it matters a lot that there's well, at least with electron beams and so on, it matters that there's a wave character of the electrons and such like. But in terms of sort of the fanciest effects of quantum mechanics, well, as a practical matter, when you figure out how to make a microprocessor, you do have to pay attention to quantum mechanics in several different ways, in the ways that the actual semiconductor works, in the ways that you're etching things out, and so on. And in the way
How small you can
but
make
you're
the
not having to pay
transistors
attention to it
versus
at the
the
level of kind of
electron size.
thinking about, oh, I'm doing a quantum algorithm rather than a traditional classical algorithm with classical logic and so on.
You don't want
The
them
same will be
jumping
true of
to
photonic
through the gates.
computation. There's a lot that will be, once one can do that, if it's even possible to make photonic switches, the you can you would expect to sort of implement the same kinds of things you do in classical computers and classical logic. Could you make use of the wave nature of photons and sort of interference patterns and so on? I'm not sure. Probably yes. Probably using some of the same formalism as in quantum mechanics, although the effects don't have to be sort of the really deep effects of quantum mechanics. I mean, it's worth saying, by the way, that there's sort of a different issue, which is when you're dealing with a microprocessor and you have electrons going from here to there, they go at a certain speed. They go at, oh, I don't know how fast it is, maybe a third of the speed of light or something.
Mm.
If you have photons, well, photons in a piece of glass go at two-thirds of the speed of light. So, there are places where it matters to have signals transmitted optically rather than electronically, although that's not as dramatic as an effect as to have sort of the whole thing operate photonically. But I think one of the things that I suspected for a while was that sort of eventually quantum computing would sort of turn into optical computing, and then sort of victory will be declared type thing. I'm not quite sure that that's quite what's going to happen at this point, because I think some sort of basic ways in which optics can be used in computing, those are already happening. The problem of inventing the photonic switch is still out there in the future and might not even be possible. I mean, it requires that there be some strange kind of material that will deal with individual photons and will sort of have the switching behavior. One just doesn't know such a thing. That such a thing exists or even could exist. I have to say, in terms of quantum computing and so on, I think
I mean, the
sort of in the
Egyptians,
quantum
in a
realm,
way,
the thing that
would
seems to be
direct
the most
photons with
immediately
their
useful is
primitive
quantum sensors,
lighting
where one's using
and
effects
how
that are from sort of
they leverage the light in the
foundational
structure.
quantum
Essentially, a
mechanics
processor
to
is
make very
that. It's just more
sensitive
complex.
measurements of things. Most obvious thing is magnetic fields, where there are sort of
Photon goes into a
quanta that you
maze,
can have where those are
finishes
sort
the
of the
maze,
very
and
lowest
escapes,
level, the very smallest
and
units
things get
of
added
kind of
together.
magnetic field that are sort of quantized, and you can start measuring those quantum flux units effectively, and that allows you to make a very sensitive magnetometer. There may be many uses for that. Certainly, some that have already come into existence are things like the Earth's magnetic field changes depending on where you are, and so you can use that as an alternative to GPS as a sort of local way of measuring where you are on the Earth's surface. And there are things one can imagine with MRI, for example, other kinds of places where actually not so much that, maybe MEG, magnetic encephalography, where you're measuring magnetic effects of nerve cell firings rather than electrical effects and so on. There are all kinds of places where you can imagine that very sensitive magnetometers might be important. I don't think we know yet what all those places are, but that's an example of something that seems to be coming from sort of the quantum realm. And there may be other kinds of very sensitive measurement techniques that can be used that sort of come out of quantum effects and so on. So a few thoughts about that. Let's see.
Oversimplified, but
Well,
how
there's a question
absurd.
here. Okay, let's look at a few of these about quantum computing. Hannah, do you think quantum computing will actually change everyday life, or will it just be for specialists? Well, right now it's not changing anything. I mean, in sort of the spin-offs from quantum computing of sort of better devices for doing computing will be probably incremental change, probably just sort of slowly introducing that technology in place of existing microprocessors. I mean, it's conceivable that there would be a big jump, that suddenly it will be possible to do computing 1,000 times faster or more. Um, I'm I'm don't immediately see that. I think it's more likely that we'll be able to do computing at a smaller, more molecular scale, more like the way biology seems to do it. And
Hmm.
well, biological, some aspects of biology. I mean, in
Yeah.
brains, that's not what's happening. There are great big neurons in brains. But at the level of molecules, the sort of dance of molecules that makes up life, that's more like actual computing done at the molecular scale. But in a sense, what's happening there is it's computing, but we don't know what it's computing other than sort of keep you, alive and happy, so to speak, because it's sort of a dance of molecules that are achieving things that we can simulate on a computer and say we're doing computing there. But what if we say, I want that dance of molecules to compute this math problem that I'm trying to solve? We don't know how to plug that together yet. Um, but I think the
My
yeah,
pothead
I
theories.
don't
And
it's an interesting
oh, actually,
question.
let's
If
hit the pendulum.
computing suddenly got 1,000 times faster, what kinds of things could
Or
we do?
the ad hoc
It's been
version.
interesting over the course of years. I've been doing language design now for what, 45 years or something. And the things that you can sort of take for granted that computers will be able to do have moved a bit over those years. I mean, the speed of computers has changed dramatically over those
Yeah,
years.
geological
Let me give you an
processor.
example.
That would work.
If you have a user interface and you say, how much can I compute? Can I just write this complicated program and have that whole program run in the time it takes me to notice that I move my finger on some slider? Well, the answer is one can do that now. That was too heavy a
Oh
lift,
shit! I dropped
let's say
ashes on
40 years
myself.
ago. And so that's something where sort of faster computing makes that possible. Video conferencing, for example, another case where sort of in a sense, there's a fixed time horizon, a fixed time interval that's determined by our ability to notice whether a video is, whether something is really moving in a video, maybe 1/15th of a second, something like this. And the question then is computing fast enough that in that 1/15th of a second, we can transmit that video frame and so on? And the answer is there came a time when that happened. There came a time when we sort of were able to get realistic
Hmm.
video transmitted, encoded by a computer, transmitted, and so on. I mean, it's the same kind of thing that happened, well, in audio much earlier, in video now.
True.
I suppose the next kinds of things are synthesizing video in real time, being able to use kind of AI techniques and others to kind of create the scene in real time. Already this is happening a whole bunch in video games, but there's more of that one can imagine happening. I mean, there's a lot of things where it's interesting to wonder what one would be able to do if one could compute 1,000 times faster. Um, and
Right.
what kinds of things were things that, well, even today, there are so many things that get done by computers where in the past it would have been you couldn't use a computer for that. It would just take, it's crazy
Yeah.
to waste that much computation. I mean, the typical computer these days, most of what it does is be idle and it's running an idle loop. And in the past, when computers were much younger, it's like every moment of computer time has to be used for something. It's not
You had to fit it. It was like
the
playing
concept,
Tetris.
or even the concept that you can watch a movie on your computer would have seemed crazy until it became the case that it was so cheap to do computing that you might as well just have that video
I mean, just
playing
using
on your
memory,
computer screen, not
memory
on a
registers
custom television or whatever.
was
So it's an interesting
an
question.
art
What
form in and
else
of
we could
itself.
do if I think sort of a lot of figuring out of predicting what's going to happen in the world that might become possible. And when I say predicting what might happen in the world, I mean at a very local scale that might become possible if you had a lot more compute at your
Hmm.
disposal. Would you be able to do, I mean, the kinds of things that are now done with things like machine learning training and so on? Yeah, those will become faster to do, and it might mean that you could do more of traditional current machine
Hmm.
learning training on the fly. I don't happen to believe that the current huge investments made in machine learning will still need to be made when we figured out more about how machine learning really works. But even if you assume that that's what you're doing, being able to compute 1,000 times faster brings into kind of personal range some of the kinds of things which in the current time are only accessible to sort of large companies spending with huge investments in these kinds of things. Let's see. Pedro asks, what could quantum computing bring to AI and machine learning? Well, first of all, as I keep on saying, I don't think the big flag of quantum computing is going to work out. But the ideas of quantum computing, that's an
Some
interesting
stuff will,
question. And you could say theoretically, if quantum computing happened,
just not.
what would occur? But by the way, coming back to the previous question about quantum computing
It has to be
changing
within
everyday
our life
life, if it really
scale,
slam dunk
maybe.
worked in a way that I think it won't, then sort of the way cryptography is done would change. People are talking a lot about, quantum safe algorithms. I think this is a very, difficult thing to discuss because it happens that there's this one example from the 1990s of a cryptography related algorithm which is kind of crushed theoretically by quantum mechanics. And you could say, well,